All right. Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today I get to talk to some friends of mine who are sociologists and political sociologists and so on, and we're going to talk about corruption. I don't think we've talked enough about that in the past because globally, of course, that's an immensely important phenomenon. And these are two guys who work on that professionally. They're in the criminology department, professors at the University of Toronto, and one of them, Leon Kosals, was a professor at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow for many years, and for political reasons, chooses to live in Canada, and therefore his teaching has been teaching at the University of Toronto for the last 10 years or so. And Matthew Light is another professor of criminology, also working on corruption, and also interested in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, the post-Soviet area. And so they're old friends. And I'm not an old friend with Matthew Light, but we certainly have reason for a connection because his father and I were graduate students together at the University of California in Berkeley 60 years ago, and or more. And so I know his dad a lot better than I know Matthew, but we are slightly acquainted, and I'm really glad to see you, Matthew. Thank you for joining us. All right, now I want to get going and ask maybe Leon, if you'll kick us off by talking a little bit about why about corruption and its importance. And then Matthew is going to, I think, tell us a little bit about how that fits into the Canadian situation. Are we as pure as the driven snow, or only purer compared to some other places in the world? Leon, hi.
Hi. Thank you, Meta, so much for this kind introduction and kind words. So, if we talk about corruption, it means usually it's people look at that as a crime, but it's not just crime. It's much broader. It's a kind of symptom of some political irregularities and dysfunctions. It's a kind of a relationship between private interests, private groups, and individuals and state. And it's quite different in various political, cultural, and socioeconomic contexts. Therefore, it's, I would say, productive approach to look at that as not just crime, but socio-political phenomenon. And it's a globe phenomenon because these trends are more, I would say, highly embedded into the political and socioeconomic change. And what is important now, that it is a kind of rise of global uncertainty because of two major shifts. The first one is the fourth industrial revolution, a new principle technologies emerged. And it is this change actually changed means also change in the understanding of corruption. Because, for example, and great uncertainty in this understanding. For example, cryptocurrencies emerged, and how it changed the whole landscape about corruption. For example, President Trump introduced new cryptocurrency. And
Mhm.
is it corruption or not? For example, it isn't possible 10 years ago, for example, or 20 years ago. But now it happened, and some people argue that it's a kind of scam. The others that maybe it's okay to do something like that, and it's a kind of uncertainty. And
Mhm.
the next trend it's a shift of socioeconomic shift and shift in global power between South and global South and global North. And it's definitely increase of power of global South. And it's also shift our understanding of corruption because the understanding of corruption in global South and practices pretty much pretty different from those that we have in global North.
How
And it
so?
yeah, and its influence also the global it's actually produce also uncertainty and great uncertainty for the I would say general population and for elite. These two trends and the cope strategy of the elites in a time of uncertainty in during unsettled times, it's corruption because I would say elite response to the rise of uncertainty. It's
You say, and you caught my attention when you said that the global South is now stronger, has more power.
relatively stronger than it was 20 or 30 years ago.
Okay, I hadn't really thought about that. And that their understanding of corruption or the type of corruption in the South is different, or what? How would you say that corruption is different from the perspective of the South?
Some practices that more or less well embedded and normalized there, as for example, Guangxi in China, or blood in Russia, or wasta in Arab uh, hemisphere, it's more or less normalized there.
Uh,
But these practices in global north, it's something that can be labeled as corruption.
yeah, yeah, okay.
And you deal in business with them, political business as well as economic business. It means that you should do something with that and to develop something. I would say some common ground,
Yeah.
right? So in this at that point, the understanding of corruption is changing, and it's uncertainty for the business people, for politicians, for members of the elite.
Okay, now
And
that's interesting right there to me. The notion that in certain countries it's just so normal that you don't even hide it. I remember, back in the 80s being in Moscow, and I had a driver who drove me around, and we would be stopped about once a week by a policeman, and my driver would get out of the car, taking his wallet out, and walk right over there and hand the guy you know, a bill and then get back in the car and drive off. And I was just amazed that it was so flagrant. But would that have been the case when it comes to higher level officials as well, that they would be open and obvious and not even ashamed of it?
it's changing over time. It definitely not now in Russia and in Moscow, not like that.
No.
Yeah, but by the way, this traffic issues, it's one area that maybe didn't change so much in compared to others because there were some trends of centralization of corruption, and now corruption, elite corruption, as well as network corruption in among elite, it's relatively hidden, more, I would say, important than it was in time of radical reform or perestroika period, because it was a process of
So
centralization
it's
of
getting
corruption.
worse again.
But again, it's changing over time. For example, after the war started, it was a kind of purge in the Ministry of Defense. After the replacement of Shoigu to Belousov. However, it was a massive money inflow in low and middle level because of the high um, mm, payments for soldiers and for the new recruits, and it's massive corruption now on the ground in front line and in various part of army, as well as not only in army, of course, but in the country related to this new war economy, military economy, as well as new relationship related to the army.
I've deflected you already into your specialty, whereas you were giving me some more general observations about the world affairs of current of corruption in the world. So I should back off and let you generalize as much as you want. But let me turn to Matthew now, and because I think you commented that it would be worthwhile comparing different countries and how Canada stacks up in the world of corruption.
Yeah, thank you, Meta, and it's great to be with you. As Leon was saying, corruption is a multifaceted phenomenon, and we shouldn't assume that simply because one aspect of it is less prevalent in a particular place that the others are not present. So I'm going to return to that. I'd just like to take a step back, though, and I think one point I often make, I teach a class in organized crime and corruption. One point I often make to my students is that corruption is an analytical category and sometimes a legal one. It's not a moral one. For example, I think most people would agree that bribing a Nazi concentration camp guard to let prisoners escape would be the moral thing to do if one were in that situation in World War II. But that act could be described as a corrupt act, right? You are paying a public servant to do something that he or she is not supposed to do based on the instructions they were given. So I think it's important to bear in mind that corruption is a name we give to a kind of set of interactions that all have in common some kind of shared understanding of element of impropriety, self-interest overriding a legal or moral obligation. So with that said, I think I'd like to make two broad points. One is that we here in Canada have a sort of tendency to see corruption as a problem of the global South or the global East, to use a term that's now being applied sometimes to the post-Soviet, post-communist region. But the truth is that whether or not we have a problem of corruption depends on how we think about what corruption is. So if you think corruption is money in envelopes or money in suitcases, we don't have a terribly big problem of corruption. There have been scandals in Canadian history that involve things like that, and at the local level, that certainly occurs from time to time. If you think that corruption is totally unqualified people being given jobs through connections, well, we have our problems with that, but they're probably not on par with some places in the world. But if you think about what is often called grand corruption or political corruption, and the way that influence can be used improperly to affect major political decisions or regulatory decisions, then I'm a lot less sure that Canada doesn't have a significant problem of corruption. Just to take one example from our own province of Ontario, right now, the trees in Ontario Place have all been chopped down, as I understand it, to make way for a spa that will be owned by this shadowy entity, Therme, which may be Swiss, maybe Romanian. I'm no longer quite sure even where it's based, right? So it has been given a very extended lease on this property over the objections of many urban planners and residents of Toronto. What's striking to me about this whole saga is that it's very clear to everybody that Premier Ford must have some connection to this business. And I say that, I'm not really giving anything away. He, has advocated for it from day one since the question about Ontario Place's future was broached, and has been very adamant that the Therme option needed to be the one that was pursued. It's to me quite striking that the question of exactly what his relationship with it has not been investigated further by the local press. It has been taken up a bit in the New York Times, which is I have to say, somewhat embarrassing for our Canadian newspapers.
Hmm.
But the point I'm coming to is, without knowing exactly what's going on there, it's hard for me to draw any definite conclusions. But I've been struck by the way that this kind of relationship has been treated as normal when
Mhm.
it's not, right? And it seems to reflect some kind of underlying interests that are not disclosed to the public. If we were in, say, Russia or Ukraine, I think everybody would call that corruption, and Westerners would be talking about it as corruption too. I even discussed this with an Israeli colleague last year who had some experience in Canada, and he made the point that, in Israel, this would also be seen as corruption. And I think that there is a certain kind of halo effect that Canada and Canadian politics benefit from,
Hmm.
in which Canada is perceived as squeaky clean, the Great White North, right, the land of snowy vistas and the Mounties, and as a result, there isn't that much investigation into what the extent to which money is allowed to permeate our politics in ways that we might not approve of, that might be unseemly or improper or even illegal. And as a result, I will add, if you look at the rankings of corruption and global perceptions indices, Canada always does very well. I'm skeptical of those findings, frankly. I think there's some reason to believe that there is a fair amount of high-level corruption in Canadian politics at the provincial and federal levels, maybe in municipal levels too.
Mhm.
So I think that's one broad point I'd like to make. The other point, perhaps, is the opposite, which is that going back to the issue that I mentioned at the beginning, that corruption is kind of analytical category, a way we describe particular kinds of transactions or relationships. It's not the only way to look at those relationships, right? So it is an allegation of impropriety in essence. What it doesn't tell us is the extent to which those relationships might have other characteristics. So um, Meta, you're a sociologist. You don't need me to tell you that there is a much broader category of informality that encompasses and extensively overlaps with corruption. And the same kind of informal relationships that produce what we would call corruption can also produce different kinds of positive benefits. So I think there's been some really interesting research done in recent years, including on the post-Soviet region, as a matter of fact, that demonstrates the kind of networks in which corruption flourishes can also have positive impacts on society. So, for example, a very talented junior colleague of mine at the University of Alberta, Yvonne Schmatko, just wrote a fantastic dissertation in which she argues, among other things, that the Ukrainian military was able to be highly adaptable in the face of the Russian invasion of 2022, in part because of its long experience with needing to source materials through informal means, so outside of official channels, sometimes involving barter or other kinds of transactions that are not strictly legal or proper, but nonetheless get the job done. So that's one example. Another example is another colleague of mine from the region, Marina Zaloznaya, wrote a great article a few years ago for a special issue that I helped co-edit, in which she argued that the networks in which networks of patronage or mutual favors, called blots in the post-Soviet context, can also be the same networks that produce civic action or activism. So corruption is, I guess, to return to kind of the broader overarching conclusion, corruption is a multifaceted phenomenon. It has
Let's play with that. That this black networks of mutual benefit can be beneficial in terms of allowing for civil society to have an impact in good ways.
Yeah, this is Marina's finding, and I think in a way it's highly paradoxical, but in a way it shouldn't surprise us, right? In the same way that sort of problems of what we would call corruption in the Ukrainian military also enabled it to be highly adaptable when disaster struck. That these all involve people coming together to solve their problems in ways that are not provided by law, and require some level of ingenuity and cooperation and trust. So ingenuity, cooperation, and trust. If you put it like that, these are widely understood to be good things, right? So corruption has a lot of harmful manifestations, and it is in many contexts a serious problem. But it's part of a larger complex of relationships that aren't necessarily all bad.
Well, but if you broaden the notion of corruption a little bit, you get fuzzy meanings. I'm thinking, for example, I assumed that corruption always involves some material benefit. Somebody's making money or something from it.
Yeah.
But here you're talking about the side effects can be maybe new social institutions or something like that. But now, I mean, there's so much going on that's really horrible in the Trump regime now, where Trump is clearly using his power illegitimately
Yeah.
to persecute his opponents. Today's newspaper lists the number of Democratic officials who are being handcuffed and dragged away by the police. And this is a new phenomenon, certainly an assault on democracy, but one wouldn't have called that corruption, but it certainly is his misuse of his power to further his own ideological or political objectives, and maybe his own financial ones indirectly. But I assume, though, that normally the concept of corruption is restricted to the notion of some material asset that is being contested.
Would you like me to respond to that, or Leon, would you like to
Yeah,
take a swing
go
at
ahead.
that? Okay, so I think I would make a few points. One is that part of what your comment brings out is that corruption is mixed up in empirically a lot of other phenomena that are related to it, but may not be exactly the same as corruption.
Yeah.
And I would add in parentheses, I think this is part of the reason why some of my colleagues don't like the term corruption, that it can sort of become everything or nothing,
Mhm.
or it can be simply a pejorative smear that you use to refer to things you don't like. So there's no doubt that the Trump administration is egregiously corrupt in the most classic sense, involving conflicts of interest, Trump benefiting financially from his position of trust, making decisions that further his own financial interests, right? That's somewhat distinct analytically from the abuses that you mentioned. I suppose the other point I would make is that I actually would quibble a bit with your definition, and it's not necessarily a trivial matter, because I think corruption, particularly at the highest levels, although money is sort of always in politics, right? It's everywhere in politics, and in some sense, it's a lot of what politics is about. I think a lot of people would say the corruption, that the key element is some kind of private gain, right? And the private gain does not have to be strictly financial for you, right? So, if you give your nephew a job, which by the way is where the word nepotism comes from, like it's related to the word nephew, you're not benefiting financially. You're benefiting emotionally. And, maybe you benefit financially if your nephew gives you a kickback, right? But you're primarily benefiting because someone you care about is getting a job. In the same way, I think at the highest levels of politics, the assumption that there needs to be a bribe going to somebody's pocket or money going into their bank account, which to be fair is certainly the case in the Trump administration in many cases, right? The sort of glaring, egregious monetary benefits accruing to Trump in ways that would have been seen as improper or illegal in any previous administration. There's no doubt about that, right? But my point is simply that political corruption can involve elements of power, right, or the benefit of one's political party, rather than simply a leader or decision maker benefiting financially in a private sense, in the way that Trump undoubtedly does.
Well, Leon said a bit ago that the South, or maybe different cultures, have different conceptions of corruption, and I wonder if that actually applies, that different places might see might define it somewhat differently. For example, nepotism. Would every culture regard nepotism as at least a shady version of corruption, or do some societies think of it as perfectly acceptable?
Why don't we ask Leah what he thinks about that?
Uh, I think that actually it's very contextual, and it depends on I would say, um, exa situation. When if we talk about some politics, they are much more, I would say, lenient to this type of relationship. In business, I would say it's more or less clear that this type of relationship, it is maybe ineffective, but it's your private issue. If you, for example, hire your nephew, it's in your private company, it's up to you, right?
Mm.
It's so in this sense, but I would say in some countries of global north, it's if it is, for example, public company, it's regulated by very strict laws and so on and so forth. Maybe it also can be perceived as corruption, but not in global south. But
Mhm.
if you deal in, I would say, uh, have some encounter of both, you should develop a kind of common ground, and usually it means that you more tolerate to corruption in general. By the way, if we look at Canada, very important, it's not only in Canada but everywhere, public perception on corruption and public attitudes towards corruption. Is it people more or less stand against, or they more or less accept this?
Mhm.
I calculated for Canada especially. In World Value Survey, they have questions about that. And according to this, during the last 3 decades, Canadians became more tolerant to corruption. So in this sense, public attitudes now different from that it was 30 years, 3 decades ago.
Okay, now just
Partially, maybe it is because of this shift of many shifts, maybe. And I think maybe it's not just only for Canada, but
you
in many
think
countries like
the
that.
Canadians are more tolerant of it now?
Yeah, according to this data, it's any data, I would say, not perfect. And of
Okay.
course, we should do more research and more and go in more into more details. But based on this world value survey data, now Canadians more tolerate to.
Okay, that's interesting and disturbing. Look, also the assumption is, my assumption is that corruption only applies to public institutions, government, uh, and not to private corporations or other in private industry, etc. That if you are the head of, Shell or something, and you give a job to your nephew, nobody would bat an eye about it because it's a private affair, private business. Is that true? And I think, in fact, that we just need a lot more accountability for corporations and private financial transactions and so on. I personally think everybody's income tax and CVs and marital history and jail records and everything should be posted on their on their website so that I could go look you guys up and figure out how many times you've been in jail before I decide whether or not to invite you on my show. I think we ought to have a lot more publicity and not all this excess notion of privacy. But this applies when it comes to private affairs. I think anybody who's that our income tax should be public record, how much we paid and how much we earned and so on. And I also think that corporate affairs should have some norms that are comparable to public norms about corruption. So set me straight and why you think I'm wrong. Everybody agrees that I'm wrong, but
It's complex issue. It's complicated issue because actually in literature you can find two points of view. First one that it just only applied to public sphere, but there are some points of view that it should be also can be applied to the private business as well. More common view that it should be only applied to the public domain of public sector. However, I think my point of view that probably mostly it should be applied to the public sector. But if we look at some type of corporations, like for example Google or Facebook and these extra big entities that have enormous power comparable to the power of some governments, I would say maybe it should be better to apply to part of them a similar approach. But anyway, I think it's not obvious. It's a lot of pros and cons.
much more cons than pro. I mean, nobody's going to agree with me.
No, but not for small businesses and middle. I don't think that for
I
all
think for
business entities
individuals.
we should apply this approach.
I think for individuals, I think everybody should be very transparent. I just hate the trend toward this fascination with privacy, which of course is occurring mostly because the amount of phishing and other fraud that goes on the internet is so much worse than it used to be, that you have to be careful all the time, that every time you answer the phone that somebody's not trying to steal from you. And you know that they most of the time, 2 or 3 times a day, they are.
This transparency is related to this issue as well as the quality of government. If it is a authoritarian regime and they try to control you, I'm not sure that this full transparency would be good. For
Yeah.
example, in China, everybody should be registered through their own ID to be presented in social media, for example. And
Well,
no anonymity there.
they catch me
I'm not sure that
finding
it's the best
anybody.
approach for all, I would say, relationships.
Okay.
For all
But
countries, for
it's
all contexts, for all cultures, and so on and so forth.
okay, but now here, corporations have secrets too, and they're not necessarily illegal. But let's say you're a corporation and you bought up some new oil fields in some other country, or let's say you bought up land in Brazil that you're going to turn into a cattle ranch, and we know that what you're doing is going to be environmentally harmful, but nobody knows that you own this property and you can do this thing secretly. It's part of your private affairs as a corporation. I consider that a kind of corruption, even though legally they have no obligation to be transparent. I just think that a lot more transparency would give us an opportunity to trust each other more and to manage social problems such as global warming. So that's a different angle, though. So
Yeah, I'm not sure that it would be good to apply the term corruption to that. Definitely, it's a social harm, and definitely it's a problem with ethics and so on and so forth. But we cannot, I would say, apply term corruption for all type of relationship and behaviors that harmful and we do not like it and so on and so forth.
mhm.
We can use other terms for that. And it's also, and I think from the analytical point of view, it maybe would be more productive to use not just label everything, all bad things by term of corruption.
Okay, I'd like to know how to do it, but go, Matthew, do you have a reaction to my radical proposal?
Yeah, so I was thinking a few things. One is that the understanding of corruption traditionally relies on a distinction between the public and private sectors, right? So as you both pointed out, what a private company does in relation to itself is not conventionally described as corruption, although it might be seen as wrongdoing or legally defined as wrongdoing in other ways, right? So we have a concepts of white collar crime and corporate crime that encompass those transactions. So, I don't actually think that the chairman of General Motors, if I remember correctly, which is a incorporated business, can actually make his or her nephew the chair, or give them a high-ranking position. I suspect that would be not possible. It's true that it would not be seen as wrongdoing in the sense of corruption if a small business owner did that, right? There are plenty of family businesses that are passed on from parents to children, or in which different family members have jobs. With that said, I think Leon made an important point that I'd like to return to, which is that the larger the corporation or the more influential the corporation becomes, the more that distinction between what is strictly private and what is strictly public begins to seem a little bit artificial, right? I think in part because it's somewhat inevitable that those businesses impinge on public interests in all kinds of ways. And to me, I think a classic example is Twitter, right? So I'm on Twitter, you're on Twitter, everyone's on Twitter, right? Twitter has become a kind of way of communicating about matters of public interest for a lot of people in the world, and yet it was allowed to be purchased by this shadowy figure, Elon Musk, who is closely connected to far right groups and possibly the Kremlin, right? And his interests now influence how Twitter is managed. And so I think to extend Leon's point a bit, there might be a sense in which we can take arguments about corruption and the dangers of corruption and apply them in contexts where, even though legally it's not a matter of a public body, right? Legally, Twitter is just a business. It could still be an argument for regulating it, or perhaps even governing its ownership structure in ways that haven't been done until now. I mean, and in a way, the fact that Musk was allowed to take it over, I think itself says something negative about our politics, right? I mean, a lot of people warned at the time this is not a good idea. He shouldn't be given this power, right? And there was sort of no legal way to stop it. Nobody in a position of power really did anything much. It was not even presented as though that was an option. And I suppose, to me, the point is not that everybody, little old Matthew Light, Meta Spencer, or Leon Kosos needs to be transparent in the same way. But certainly, in a world of mega corporations that are highly influential, I think there is a case that those bodies need to be accountable to the public in ways that maybe have not been fully accepted or processed. Um, Returning to a point that I raised earlier about sort of expectations about corruption in different settings, something that's become sort of apparent to me, and since Trump began his political career, is that there is a lot of acceptance of non-transparency in Western countries that would never be tolerated in global South or post-communist countries.
Oh,
So, well, for example, Ukraine, which until the invasion of by Russia was sort of under constant criticism for its problems of corruption, has, under the pressure of international financial institutions, embarked on a very sweeping policy of financial disclosure and asset disclosure from major public officials. So, judges, members of parliament, all these people are much more regulated in their positions in terms of what they have to disclose and what kinds of businesses they can be engaged in than their equivalents in the U.S. or Canada. And the U.S. obviously is particularly with Trump in power, is the most glaring example of this. But I wouldn't say that Canada is so remote from that either. I mean, we don't really know much about Prime Minister Carney's taxes. He has not had to disclose his financial transactions. It appears that he owns businesses that are registered in tax havens. What are those businesses, right? So I think that your point about sort of the need for transparency is something that we in the global north could reasonably apply to our own leadership as a start, especially given that we've been quite insistent about other countries taking that medicine.
It would be a heavy lift even here. I wouldn't if I'm trying to pick my fights, I want to pick something that I have a good chance of winning. And I don't think I have a prayer in hell of getting success in making big corporations or even certainly the
Yeah,
officers of them to disclose their personal financial situation.
yeah. I mean, it's worth mentioning that after Trump left office the first time, there was some interest in trying to improve transparency and other kinds of restrictions on corruption in the U.S. A lot of which in the past have sort of involved kind of informal norms or gentlemen's agreements, right? So I'm trying to remember exactly when the custom began of the president disclosing his or her, or presidential candidates, in fact, disclosing their tax returns. It may have been under President Ford as a post-Watergate response. So, that was done for a good 40 years, right? And Trump stopped doing it. So now where are we? I mean, clearly the norm is not enough, and that would be an argument for a law to require that. I
Yeah,
agree with
I'll join your campaign, but you get to lead it because I'm not, I wouldn't bet on that one succeeding.
well, it's in a way a kind of obvious thing to aim for, right? Like that
Yeah,
there
yeah.
should be basic
Oh yeah.
basic transparency about
I
the
think
financial interests of
a
people.
huge, it's not just a little reform, it would make a big, big difference. Of course, a question of how far you want to extend it, but I would go very far in making everything, almost everything about one's life, public record, you know.
Hmm.
What kind of grades you got in the sixth grade on arithmetic?
Interesting.
Okay. Now I know that both of you are working on corruption in the post-Soviet area, different countries. I think you're also in Estonia now, but uh, and all of you, both of you have been worked on things in Central Asia, right? Kazakhstan and so on. Tell me what are you doing compatible questions? What kinds of issues are you addressing about corruption in that area?
Leon, why don't you go ahead and I'll answer after you.
Um, yeah, we can compare, for example, Russia and then Central Asia. And I did research in comparison, for example, Kazakhstan and Russia at that point, and then the corruption in police. And by the way, it's an interesting that it's Russia as well as Kazakhstan countries of civil law jurisdictions. And they're more regulated there. For example, what kind of additional jobs you can have if you are a police officer as
Mhm.
public servant, and it's much more restrictive there than, for example, in the U.S. and in Canada, because there it's acceptable only if you have jobs as a researcher, artist, or educator. Other type of second jobs forbidden there. uh, Someone can argue that it's this because of, I would say, other institutions are very well developed in common law jurisdictions, and you cannot, for example, violate the code of conduct so easily here in Canada or the US, then it is possible, for example, in Russia or in Kazakhstan. So in this sense, it makes sense that it's more regulated there because, for example, market system it's weaker and worse work there than in Canada or in the US. Therefore, more strict regulations there. And there are some differences between Russia and Kazakhstan too, because in Kazakhstan, I would say more developed a kind of informal relationship and familial relationships than in Russia. in this sense, this network corruption, they are more developed than in Russia, where more formal institutions are in place. So in this sense, it's of course corruption depends on the culture as well and cultural norms and relationships. And even it's very similar, I would say, legal systems as in case of Russia and Kazakhstan.
Mhm.
This is influence their real involvement in corruption and in types of corruption that's developed more in one country and less developed in another. For
Well,
example,
I've heard a lot about Ukraine being we've all heard that that Ukraine was quite corrupt until, even up to the time of the war, and probably still, I don't know. But is that equally true in all of the post-Soviet countries, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and so on? And would you contrast that? I know, Matthew, you're also doing work in Estonia, which has joined the West. So would you say that there's a difference that comes from being Eastern or Western, as opposed to being post-Soviet country?
So, yes, I have done research in both Ukraine and Estonia, and my two most recent publications concern those countries and did involve issues of corruption. So, I think what I would say is that corruption is not static. It can evolve in different ways under different kinds of influences. And there's no doubt that Ukraine was lambasted for its corruption problems, maybe with some fairness, maybe in ways that, for reasons I already alluded to, are a bit unfair. But nonetheless, the problems existed and continue to exist. I think, though, that when the war started, one of the things that became apparent was that the reforms that had been pushed through in Ukraine over the last decade, roughly since it came more into the orbit of the West, had actually been quite effective in a lot of ways. So, one point that's often made is that Ukraine's local government institutions turned out to be quite decisive in a number of important areas of the war in terms of rallying public support against the invasion or organizing public resistance. And that is, that is an aspect of administrative and political reform in Ukraine since 2014. So clearly, Ukraine has problems of corruption. I don't want to minimize them, but it's not corruption is not something that just exists innately, right? It is a response to particular conditions, and it can be modified, although it's not easy to do so. I think maybe one point that I would say comes out of my observations in these two countries is that in both cases, part of what needs to happen for corruption to be addressed effectively is for powerful actors to perceive that it's in their interest to curb it. To take an example from Estonia, a few years ago, some colleagues and I wrote a paper about the private security industry there, and one of our findings was that unlike other post-Soviet countries, there is a clear distinction between the private aspects of security that are available for commercial purchase, essentially, and the public ones that are controlled by the state and are funded
Are
by.
we talking about you hire somebody to guard your building at
Yeah,
night?
for example, yeah, that's
Okay,
right. That would be, yeah.
that kind of thing.
So, in a lot of the post-Soviet region, those businesses are, to use a technical term, very shady, right? So they might be kind of connected to organized crime entities and be kind of violent and themselves involved in illegal activities, and or they might involve off-duty police officers doing things that are extremely unethical, or involve forms of even sort of extortion or protection rackets. And we were quite struck that Estonia seems to have avoided these pitfalls. And the explanation that we arrived at I'm going to summarize the findings rather than taking you through the whole study because that might be boring. But basically, what we argue is that ultimately, this had to do with the fact that the government of Estonia really wanted to keep the influence of Russia out of its police and made a lot of efforts to ensure that the police were sort of transparent and could not be involved in managing the economy. And I think in a way it's an example of kind of an anti-corruption reform that it's not about sort of the things people associate with corruption, like bribes, right? It's about institutions, hardening institutions, making them more effective in doing the things they're supposed to do, making sure that they're funded properly, right? And and the ways that anti-corruption measures have succeeded in Ukraine have often involved those. And when corruption is still a major issue, another recent piece that some colleagues and I wrote had to do with municipal policing in Ukraine. Those are often areas that have kind of been ignored or seen as unimportant, and allowed to sort of to fly under the radar.
Mm. Yeah, well, that you've got around to one of the questions, that everybody wants to know is if you've got a problem with corruption, how and whether it's possible to overcome it. How do you fight it? And I'm thinking of I mentioned the time my driver would get out of the car and pay off the policeman right there. And I
Yeah.
mentioned this to my friend when I got home that one of those nights, and she said, well, of course, the man has no other source of income. He isn't paid properly, and unless you give him a good salary, of course, that, it's like she was excusing it because he wasn't paid right. Fair enough, that may be a good excuse, but maybe that's not the main thing that you want to go at when you're trying to talk about corruption in high places, the head of a corporation or something, or a Premier Ford.
Right.
It's not that he isn't making enough money to get along. But what general principles can you suggest as universally desirable as ways of going about reducing corruption?
I think I'll let Leon start with that because it's such a big question.
You're giving
Think
him
about my
a hard
answer.
question. I gather that's a hard question.
Yeah, I would like to address a point that Matt stressed about the political, I would say, aspect of corruption. That is very important. And if we look at Russia, for example, we have, from this perspective, we have two types of corruption. It's first, it's I would say, unofficially or informally sanctioned corruption. It's actually the major part of corruption. It's something that top elite, they are more or less informed and involved, and they sanctioned it as a tool to accumulation of informal resources to some, not for their personal gain mostly, because they're wealthy enough without that, but to accumulate some, I would say, not publicly controlled resources. It's functional. For the system, it's very functional, and it's a part of the political system. Sometimes they call it a mafia state, but in fact, it doesn't mean that it's some mafia types relationship and so on and so forth. More important, that it's a part of an official agenda. For example, if you should pay someone do something illegal abroad, for example, to corrupt some politician in Europe, you should have some funds for that. The funds not in the official budget.
Okay.
So you should accumulate some unofficial resources.
Okay, now
to-
if you're a Western business person and you're going to deal with people in that official corruption thing, do Western businesses ever informally put aside a slush fund for you to use in bribing or doing business
It was possible. It was possible before this special Foreign Anti-Corruption Act, because now it's illegal in most Western countries to do something like that. But before that, it was even in Germany, for example, they even can include it in the tax return.
Oh,
Yeah, of the company. Not now. It was in the past.
mhm.
But in Russian case, it's partially it's a part of their of their political agenda. This type of corruption as a tool of accumulation of informal resources. without public control, because something that in the official state budget, it's publicly controlled, and you should disclose that in Russia as well. It's in this
Okay, now
sense.
that you've partly answered my question, which is if you're in charge of getting rid of corruption, what are the steps that you would take? You would change the laws about that, how you report your taxes and so on, and make it
Yeah.
illegal. What else?
Not just laws, it's a wider political reform. Because if you keep the system as now in Russia they have, corruption, it's a part of the system, it's unavoidable. Of course, part of the corruption motivated by personal greed of some officials. And in this sense, most of that we have in statistics, it's something that's this type of corruption. I mean, in the Russian statistics and in
Yeah,
similar
I
type
have
of
a
stuff.
friend, Konstantin Samoilov, who is a Russian who's in Uzbekistan now because of, trying to avoid being conscripted for mobilization for the war. And he says that the mafia is back. He even uses the word that right recently in Russia, more and more, there's a resurgence of what he identified as mafia, that apparently that has fluctuated a lot since the 90s. Is that consistent with what you're saying or not?
Mafia actually, it's now. I think in 2000s they were part of the system as well, and they controlled and subordinated by intelligence and police. In this sense, they're more tool than independent actors.
Mhm.
In this regard, of course, maybe now they have more opportunities to act because it's more, I would say, uncertainty and more new opportunities. But in fact, they're more or less controlled
Mhm.
uh, during last 2 decades.
They're
It's
more or less controlled, you say?
Yeah, more or less embedded into the
Oh,
system. In
embedded.
this sense, they're, of course, not maybe directly controlled, but they are part of the system, and they
So
more or less
it's getting
coordinate their activities in some way.
so it's not getting better and it could be getting worse, is what I'm hearing you say, right?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Well, is there any country that has made a huge concerted effort to get rid of corruption and has conspicuously succeeded? And if so, what did they do? Maybe Matthew, do you know of a case that a country has really cleaned it up?
Well, I think, there are probably a lot of examples we could take from different parts of the world, and it might be at the level of particular institutions rather than countries, or, to some degree, countries as a whole. I think there's no doubt that post-communist countries, particularly those that have been absorbed into democratic institutions, are considerably less corrupt than they used to be. I would add, I hate to say it, but there's no reason in principle why authoritarian countries cannot control certain kinds of corruption, right? So, I think Leon made the point earlier that some kinds of bribery of Russian police are now much less common than they were 20 years ago, right? And it's not necessarily the case that corruption is only tackled by democratic regimes. Um, I was thinking about your earlier question about sort of are there high level lessons? And I think that I'm definitely with Leon in the sense that um, there are so many different forms of corruption that trying to sort of provide an account to solving them is going to be difficult. I mean, as he says, figures like Putin are not interested in expanding their personal wealth at this point. I mean, Putin is super rich. I think he's not about sort of needing money for his next vacation or his retirement account, unlike some of us, right? For him, in some sense, the he is at the apex of, as a number of Russian scholars have pointed out, a kind of an apex of informal power relations among leading officials and business executives, in which he's the role of guarantor, and his interest is keeping the whole system going, since he is the principal beneficiary. Um, a figure like Trump, I think requires very different kinds of remedies, and we've already discussed that. When we're talking about sort of institutions that actually serve the public, the issues may be quite still, quite different, right? So, in the context of local policing in Ukraine, what we found was that there was a certain kind of unwillingness by the central government to recognize the demands of local governments to have some kind of level of control over the way that policing was provided in their communities, and that this created an opportunity for corruption to emerge. So I suppose one point I would say is to think about aligning incentive structures for those in public, both with the constraints of reality and with the kinds of norms that we want to uphold. And those two goals, or those two kinds of poles, might be in conflict in some ways, but I think they both need to be kept in mind. That is why, in part, in some cases, part of the solution for corruption, even though people hate to hear it, might be thinking about sort of improving salaries for public servants in some contexts, or ensuring that they have the ability to do their jobs with the resources that are given. That's very different from how, I think the discussion we had earlier about sort of controlling the behavior of executives at companies like Twitter, or major public officials in Western countries. The prescriptions might be totally different, and in a way that would be sort of hard to square them.
But this has been extremely interesting. I've got it's time, we're over time, but it's worth it. So thank you both, and fascinating. And we'll probably come back and do another go around sometime, okay?
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.